It was supposed to be just another routine drive home. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban streets. The hum of the engine filled the air as Marcus Fields, a calm, reserved man in his early 40s, cruised through the neighborhood. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror said otherwise. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, a knot of unease forming in his chest. His heart pounded louder with each pulse. He knew how these situations could go. He'd seen it too many times on the news. Still, he kept his hands firmly on the wheel, breathing deeply to steady himself. Behind him, Officer Greg Harper adjusted his mirrored sunglasses, his jaw set in a scowl. The kind of scowl worn by someone who had already decided the outcome of this encounter. To him, Marcus was just another target. A black man driving a nice car in a neighborhood where Harper thought he didn't belong. The officer approached slowly, hand resting on his holster. Marcus watched in the side mirror, forcing his breath to stay calm. The tension thickened as Harper tapped on the window with two sharp knocks. "License and registration." Marcus nodded, moving carefully. No sudden movements. Always polite, always controlled. "Is there a reason you stopped me, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice measured. Harper didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the interior of the car, narrowing, looking for something. Anything. "You were driving a little too slow back there," Harper replied, voice cold. "Mind if I take a look around the vehicle?" Marcus knew his rights. He knew this stop was wrong, and the injustice of it all weighed heavily on him. Yet he stayed silent, choosing restraint over confrontation. His heart pounded louder in his chest, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as Harper's boots crunched against the gravel, retreating to his patrol car with the documents. The tension in the air felt suffocating. Marcus's breathing slowed, each inhale measured. He couldn't shake the feeling that this stop wasn't just routine. It felt targeted. His mind raced with the stories he'd seen before, the moments where compliance hadn't been enough. But he reminded himself to stay calm, his eyes fixed on the patrol car's taillights. The radio chatter from Harper's vehicle barely registered as Marcus scanned the faces of the growing crowd. Some looked curious, others concerned. He felt their stares pressing against him like a spotlight, illuminating his vulnerability. Yet he remained composed, knowing his every action would be judged. Harper lingered longer than necessary in his car, the delay only adding to the gnawing dread in Marcus's chest. Time felt stretched thin, each second dragging. The silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deliberate, a power play. Marcus exhaled, the ache in his chest persistent. He could feel it, the storm building. He just didn't know how far it would go. Harper returned, but this time with backup. Another squad car pulled in behind his, lights flashing. The reflection of the red and blue lights danced along the pavement, making the quiet street feel like a crime scene. Two more officers stepped out, both standing tall and stiff, their hands resting on their belts, not as a precaution, but as a silent message. The sight made Marcus's pulse race faster. His heart hammered against his chest like it was trying to break free. Harper's voice sharpened, the condescension in his tone unmistakable. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Marcus hesitated just for a moment, but then nodded and complied. Every movement was measured, his hands visible, his breathing steady. He couldn't afford to be perceived as a threat. "What's this about?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice calm despite the tension rising in his throat. His fingers tingled as adrenaline coursed through him. Harper ignored the question, waving to the other officers with a casual flick of his hand. "Search the vehicle." Marcus felt a surge of anger tighten his chest, but he said nothing. He knew his rights. He hadn't consented to a search. But speaking up here, in this moment, surrounded, could make things worse. His mind raced through every headline, every tragic story he'd ever seen. The officers searched his car without care, overturning the glove box, rifling through the compartments, pulling up the floor mats. They weren't searching. They were looking to humiliate him, a spectacle, and it was working. Marcus felt the heat of shame burning through his chest as he stood there, being watched. The crowd had begun to gather, neighbors stepping out of their homes, whispering, pointing. Phones came out. He could feel their eyes on him, not as a man but a suspect, a problem. Harper wasn't done. He took a step closer, invading Marcus's personal space. His voice dropped to a low, venomous whisper. I don't know what you're hiding, but we'll find it. You people always have something to hide, don't you? Marcus felt the words hit like a slap. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, nails pressing into his palms. The heat of injustice boiled inside him, but he wouldn't break. Not here. Not in front of them. Suddenly, one of the officers searching his car froze. The entire mood shifted. The officer's hands shook as he examined Marcus's wallet, flipping open the identification inside. His brows furrowed deeply, and he exchanged a glance with the second officer. The silence felt heavier, stretching tighter with every heartbeat. Marcus could hear the sound of his own breathing, controlled but shaky, the pulse throbbing in his ears. The officer holding his wallet looked as if he had seen a ghost, his pale face reflecting a sudden realization he couldn't ignore. The badge in his hand felt heavier now, a symbol that carried far more weight than expected. Harper's eyes narrowed as he noticed the hesitation, his smug demeanor faltering for the first time. He took a slow step forward, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the only sound cutting through the oppressive quiet. The officer stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he called out, Greg, you might want to take a look at this." Harper's gaze snapped toward the wallet, suspicion shifting into confusion. His outstretched hand took the wallet, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, the crowd of onlookers holding their breath in collective anticipation. Harper flipped the wallet open, the official Department of Justice badge catching the sunlight, gleaming like an accusation. The arrogant grin drained from Harper's face. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, the realization of his mistake settling in. His grip on the wallet tightened for a moment before his hand dropped slightly, unable to meet Marcus's calm, unwavering stare. The crowd, sensing the shift, grew even quieter. Phones stayed raised, recording every second. The balance of power had begun to shift, and everyone could feel it. Harper snatched the wallet, lips curling into a sneer, until he saw the badge inside. Federal. Department of Justice. Marcus Fields wasn't just anyone. He was a civil rights attorney and a federal investigator, a man who had spent his career fighting the very injustices unfolding in this moment. The shift was instant. Harper's face paled, his arrogant posture faltering. Marcus's voice, calm but steely, broke the silence. "Now, would you like to explain why you pulled me over, Officer Harper? Or should I call the state attorney's office myself?" The silence was deafening. Harper stammered, his hands trembling slightly. The gathered crowd had their phones out now, recording everything. Marcus stepped forward, his composure unwavering. But inside, a storm brewed. His heart pounded against his chest, a deep, aching reminder of how close this moment had come to spiraling out of control. Yet his face remained calm, measured. He refused to let the anger, the years of being underestimated, spill out in front of the crowd watching with bated breath. He locked eyes with Harper, whose face had drained of all its earlier arrogance. The officer's mouth opened as if searching for words, but nothing came out. His throat bobbed as he struggled to process what was unfolding. The badge in his hand seemed to weigh him down, a symbol of the authority Marcus now clearly held over him. The crowd remained silent, phones still raised, recording every second of the uncomfortable standoff. The weight of that moment pressed heavily on Harper, the reality of the situation finally settling in. Marcus, steady as ever, continued speaking. "You didn't just stop me, Officer Harper. You humiliated me. You assumed I was less, that I didn't belong, but I do belong. And now the world can see what you tried to do." Harper's face flushed, a deep crimson spreading up his neck as the tension in the air thickened further. He opened his mouth again, this time managing only a stammered, barely audible, "I," before falling silent once more. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice. The steady calmness in his words was louder than any shout. He stood tall, unflinching, while Harper's posture sagged, his authority crumbling with every second. The eyes of the crowd shifted from Harper back to Marcus, and in that moment, the power had undeniably shifted. Harper knew it, and so did everyone watching. By the next morning, the footage had gone viral. News stations were already picking up the story. The headline, "Racist Cop Pulls Over DOJ Investigator." Instant regret. The police department issued a public statement. Harper was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Calls for his termination echoed online. Protests grew, demanding systemic change. But Marcus didn't stop there. He used the moment to spark dialogue. Standing in front of the courthouse steps, he addressed a growing crowd. "This wasn't just about me," he began, voice clear and steady. "It's about accountability, respect, and ending assumptions that divide us." The crowd nodded, energized. People were listening. Marcus left the podium knowing the fight wasn't over. But something had changed. For the first time, he could feel the shift, not just in policy, but in hearts and minds. The faces in the crowd reflected more than sympathy. They reflected understanding, a recognition of injustice that was hard to ignore. As he stepped down from the podium, the weight of the moment pressed on him. Marcus felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. His words echoed in his mind, each sentence reminding him of the power of standing firm, even when the odds felt overwhelming. He glanced at the news cameras still rolling, capturing every moment. The footage would continue spreading, reaching homes, schools, and workplaces across the nation. Perhaps this time people wouldn't just listen, perhaps they would act. In the crowd, a young boy held his mother's hand tightly. Marcus noticed the way the child stared at him, not with fear, but with admiration. That look, that quiet acknowledgement, stirred something deeper than any headline could. As Marcus walked away, a quiet determination settled in. This wasn't just about policy or justice. It was about dignity, about teaching the next generation that silence in the face of injustice could never be the answer. The shift had begun, and he wasn't done yet. Have you witnessed injustice like this? Share your story in the comments below. Together we can make change. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories that matter.